Good evening. My name is Karen Penner, and I'm an adjunct assistant professor here at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. Tonight, we're exploring what happens next for the nation's students and schools as we begin to emerge from the pandemic, and how reporters are reporting on education. For students, teachers, parents, administrators, and politicians, the past 14 months of school closings and reopenings have posed huge challenges, and we don't yet know what the consequences will be for students. Meanwhile, kids are coping with these stresses as our society at large begins to reckon with racism and gun violence. Fortunately, we have three excellent journalists joining us to explore these issues and talk about reporting on them. Sonali Coley has reported on education and breaking news for the Los Angeles Times since 2015. She's written on high schools in LA surrounded by homicide and covered the Los Angeles teachers' strike. At the moment, she's a Spencer Education Fellow at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, and she's working on a book about teenage activists. Prior to joining the LA Times, Sonali worked as a Metro reporter for the Orange County Register and as a reporter covering education and diversity for Quartz. Sonali will moderate the conversation tonight. Nicole Avery Nichols is editor-in-chief of Chalkbeat. She joined the publication in March, just last month. Congratulations, Nicole, after many years at the Detroit Free Press, most recently as the senior news editor, where she coordinated coverage of the coronavirus pandemic, the Me Too movement, the opioid crisis, and much more. A native New Yorker, Nicole started her career as a weekend reporter at the Observer-Dispatch in upstate New York more than 2 decades ago. Eliza Shapiro is a reporter covering New York City education for the New York Times. She joined the Times in 2018 after 5 years as an education reporter for Politico New York. She has also been a reporter for the Daily Beast. Eliza grew up in New York and attended public and private schools in Manhattan and Brooklyn. So welcome to Sonali, Nicole, and Eliza. I just wanted to mention that you can put your questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat for those questions, and we'll be sure to leave some time at the end to address them. So now over to you, Sonali.
Hello, thanks so much for having us. I'm Sonali. I'm thrilled to be here and to talk to Eliza and Nicole, who are both brilliant and who I'm meeting for the first time today, I think. Eliza and I might have crossed paths at like a journalism conference or but since this is, I know you got our little bios, but since this is a J School event, I would love if in 1 minute or less, you could talk about how you got into education reporting and why, if you like education reporting as I do, why you want this beat. I can start. I was assigned education at Quartz when I was there, but I quickly came to love it because I realized that everything that happens in the world, truly everything, touches kids. And I don't think that that's true for, I think their beat other than like healthcare at this point, although now I realize it's probably true for more and more things, but I just love it because I could write about anything through the lens of kids. So I care about equity and social justice and mental health. And I was able to write about how all of those things affect children. So that's how I came to it and why I love it. Nicole, do you want to?
Sure. I'm a newbie on the education beat. I think that this year was really pivotal for me in terms of really uncovering the voices that were forced to whisper, as I've said. Before. I was leading coverage at the Free Press on the coronavirus, specifically looking at health And every morning, meeting with the health team, some of the conversations we were having that were not being covered by legacy media had a lot to do with things that were going on in our houses, our kids going to school, interactions with teachers, remote learning, fits and starts, and all of these things. And we would talk about them for the first 5 minutes in conference, and then quickly move ahead to all the huge news of the day. So when this opportunity came from Chalkbeat, it was like, that's really interesting. And being someone who cares a lot about equity and underrepresented people, and understanding how impactful the pandemic has been on communities of color, it just kind of led me to the right spot at the right time. So this has just really been fascinating since March 1st. I'm working with a very talented group of journalists, and they're really passionate about education, and I'm glad to be here.
Truly, what a time to join our ranks. Welcome.
Right.
Eliza?
Learn quick. Yes. Learning on the job. Yes.
No kidding. So education was actually also somewhat randomly assigned to me on my first day as a beat, New York City beat reporter at Politico 8 years ago. And it was like just total serendipity. It became this beat that I almost can't imagine doing anything else. I mean, really, it's like been almost a decade, not only on education, but specifically on New York City education. Obviously, there's so much that's rewarding and wonderful and intellectually stimulating about it. But what I have loved probably the most is that I feel that covering schools here in New York specifically, I'm a native New Yorker, has really allowed me to tell the story of the city in a way that I wouldn't be able to in any other way. So like get to know New York on a much, much, much deeper level than I ever did before, and just actually tell the story of what's going on in New York, changes in city life, tell the story of the de Blasio administration through schools. So that's been part of what's been so rewarding for me.
That's amazing. And that's exactly how the LA Times job was pitched to me by the person who hired me, was we want you to tell the story of LA through the kids. So I love that lens. Okay, so on to the stuff we've been reporting on. I've been out of the newsroom doing fellowship for the last 8 or 9 months, but when before I left, we were trying to figure out what learning loss was going to look like in the pandemic based on like the very faulty research that exists on summer learning loss, which really is like very inconclusive. So can you tell us a little bit about how we're actually going to measure learning loss? Like, should it be measured? What's the conversation there, and how are you going to look to covering it moving forward? Eliza, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. So, I mean, I think some of the typical tools we would have to just see where kids are, obviously these have always been imperfect, complicated tools, but, testing and assessments have been really compromised, obviously, over the last year. So in New York, for example, and this is the case in many other places, sort of state tests that typically tell us a range of where kids are being given on an opt-in basis this year. So you have to actively decide you want to take a standardized test, or you want your kid to take a standardized test, which is not going to happen on any sort of wide level. We're already seeing in some suburban districts in New York that most kids are just not even bothering showing up. So we don't have the tools that we have been using for some decades to figure out how kids are doing. And I think one of the big questions here, this is not an answer, but we're going to have to really think seriously about what the other tools should be. Because especially in a district which is the size of New York's, which is a million kids and 1,800 schools, I couldn't tell you right now what's going on, nor could the mayor, nor could the chancellor. I mean, it's going to be a little bit, as kids start coming back, just like teachers checking in, a lot of like one-on-one assessments. And so we may not have a sense for some months, I would say, probably until at least the end of the year, the end of the calendar year, of like what is going on. And we need new tools to figure it out. And I don't know what they are. And it's like kind of like, it's a kind of a brave new world.
Right. I mean, it's you know, comforting almost to hear you say that, because in terms of assessment, you want, as a journalist, you want a measurable, right? You want a number to aim at, even as a parent, as a community. You want to know how far are we behind, actually. And we just, after 2 years of non-standardized testing, we're just not seeing that across the board in an easy way. So I think where some of the interesting reporting lies is the pivot, you know, those personal assessments, those some of that out of the box measurements, you know, of students and aptitude and, you know, loss and gain. It's just really important for our education system to be a little bit nimble, and for us as community and as journalists to be a little bit more patient and do a lot of probing on some of this data. But there are some figures that say that we're a couple of points behind, 6 points behind in math, you know, 2 points behind in reading, and for, you know, communities of color, maybe a little bit more, but is it reliable, and is it fair to measure after these 2 years, you know, a year and a half or whatever, 2 years, actually 2 full learning years, is it fair to measure kids in that way?
It's wild that it's going to be at least 2 years. And I also think like it's so good for any journalist to hear experienced journalists saying, like, we don't know and it's okay. And in your stories, you have to reflect that nobody really knows and they're trying to figure it out. A lot of times there might be another reporter or an assigning editor who is pushing a certain narrative that they've heard or read somewhere and want you to confirm it. But it's okay to say we don't know. So I'm glad that you both were open about that.
And actually, I just would love to really underline that. I mean, I have certainly experienced that over the last year, because obviously we really want to know, and it's important to know. And it takes a lot to be able to say to your boss or your editor or whatever, like,
Right.
there's really no good answer here, but it's actually one of the most important things you can do, especially as an education journalist, because like, if you're just going to go along, you're like, okay, well, I should match this story. The Wall Street Journal had this story about learning loss. Like, you could change the way a lot of people in America think about this issue. And that would be really bad if you're not right. Or you don't know. Anyway, sorry I interrupted you.
No, you didn't. That's important.
Yes.
And the way to get to that point is to like read all of the research, even the one that's problematic, and talk to the people so you can know what's wrong with it. So there's a lot of legwork that goes in before it. But it's okay to do a ton of research and then still say, I don't know. That's okay. So the next question that I have, and please, if either of you want to add more, please do. But I want to talk a little bit about mental health impacts. So we know that kids' mental health has been impacted in the last year because of COVID and remote schooling, and also because there's been kind of another national reckoning with racism and the deadly and horrible effects of it. And so how are you reporting mental health among kids, and what are schools thinking about doing, and what do they need to do to allow students to actually learn and to be well emotionally and mentally?
I mean, you know, the discussion of mental health and education, it's a lot of breaking news driving it in terms of, you know, maybe stimulus dollars being allocated for those services specifically. So we're responding a lot to the breaking news of it. But as you sort of dig down into the analysis of what does that mean? How does that manifest itself for kids and teachers and administrators? What is that, what does a mental health issue look like? And what are we walking into for the next school year? I mean, I think it's really important to be on the ground level And that's something that Chalkbeat does really, really good, of connecting with school communities, speaking to teachers, speaking to students about some of their needs. And I mean, before the pandemic, I don't know that I personally realized how important some of those peripheral extracurricular things were for community and growth and mental health. The conversations in the hall, bands, choir, drama, all of these things, the prom, all of these things that are missing, have had an impact on lots of children, particularly kids who, have disabilities, also in English learners, people who need more entree into communities. So these are really, really important and heavy issues. And it will be interesting to see next year, hopefully, as we get closer to normal, what that really looks like, what some of those services look like in the schools on the ground level.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I would say that's one of my big priorities for the fall and summer, now that more people are getting vaccinated and it's easier to be in schools and spend more time with kids and families in their own homes, is to really, really focus in on that. So I would just obviously echo everything that Nicole said.
It's so funny. Like I had I was having a meeting with some of the reporters about, the stimulus funding and follow the money. And, this is me, we really have to be in tune to the quality of the spend. That was my thing. And, if schools just open up the gym and have sports in there, we need to be on it. And one of the reporters said to me, well, maybe that's what's needed, right? So just having to sit in that notion of this summer and summer school, maybe it isn't a huge, curriculum-based thing that solves all of our problems, but maybe it's kickball. Just making space for that notion is just something I had to have a conversation personally with myself about as a journalist.
Totally. That's so interesting, because it's like in a normal time or year, obviously there's so much accountability reporting to be done, right. But so much of what we have to do is say, like, kids need to be around each other and they need to be around adults who care about them. So like that baseline is not being reached currently in America. So like, that's a really low bar, but it's a bar we haven't reached. So let's get to that bar. And that's our first piece of accountability. Just allow kids to see each other and see the adults in their lives anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. That is really interesting because mental health is has to be addressed in so many ways throughout the school day. A lot of people think it's just getting more mental health counselors in schools, which it absolutely is. There are not nearly enough, but there's also a shortage of those counselors who are qualified to be working in schools. And so there have to be a lot of other things. So that's a great point. And I also think that, Nicole, that sounds like a great example of when a reporter pushed back a little bit in a way that helped move the coverage forward. And it sounds like you were a great manager because you actually thought about it and took it in and applied it to the work. So that's great. Okay, so and you touched on this a little bit with the stimulus funding, but I wanted to ask about that also. What are you looking for in terms of coverage? Obviously following the money, but do you know right now what schools are going to be using it for and what you're going to be focusing on for that? Eliza, you want to go first?
Sure. So, since I cover a district, I'm kind of mapping out my priorities now. So the mayor in the last few days, now that there's this, there were these dire warnings about the budget this time last year, and now, the country and school districts are in a much, much better place. So in New York, the mayor has been prioritizing actually, mental health services, counselors, still a little light on details, but taking a close look at that. And then he's invested $500 million for the next budget for catching kids up. Again, we don't really know what that means. It could be a combination of tutoring and other programs. But I'm actually, as as Nicole said, very interested in the quality of the spend there around catching kids up, because if you invest in tutoring, that's great, but it really does have to be high quality, well executed tutoring, for example. So I'll be looking really carefully, particularly around like the academic components, to see how that money is spent, because it's still a little vague.
Nicole, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the same. I'm looking to share a story with you all in the chat, just about a story that came out of Illinois about a chunk of federal funding that's going to be allocated for, tutoring services. And it's still about, even though we know that these are extraordinary circumstances, it still is about accountability also. So when we see news like this in states that we cover, Colorado, we're in Philadelphia, New York, New Jersey, Detroit also, we are looking to make sure that that money actually reaches the end user. So if we're spending these funds on tutoring services, on advertising for preschool, and things like that, we saw that story today in Chicago. We just want to make sure that it actually lands.
Yeah.
So we will be following the money. Yes.
That is a huge issue. I completely agree. And I was gonna add also, allocating funding is so different than spending it. A lot of times districts allocate funding. They say like X school, you have X money to hire this person, but the school doesn't have the time, or the principal doesn't have the time or the resources to hire that person, or there aren't enough, like there's so many reasons. So I think in a year, in 2 years, there's going to have to be accountability work to see, okay, the school got the money, but did they use it? And if they didn't use it, did it roll over? Did it go back into the overall district budget? And writing those stories in a way that's not like super, super wonky, but connects to actual kids is going to be important.
The money it's tremendous, unprecedented amount of cash flowing into the educational system. So I do think that we have to make sure that it actually leads to better education, better mental health, stronger school communities. And it's just going to require a lot of connected reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. Which kind of leads into my next question, which is that there's also going to have to be accountability to make sure that the money is dispersed equitably, which means different things to a lot of different people who are in charge of that money. And so there's always been inequity in schooling. It has existed before the pandemic, and it continues to exist. There's been a lot of concern that it's going to worsen. Eliza, you've done great work on this. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, and Nicole, you mentioned it earlier as well. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the disparities in access and schooling for groups of kids, racially, socioeconomically. There's students who are vulnerable because they're homeless or disabled, or English learners. So can you talk a little bit about what has been happening with those students and how we can report on them in a way that is useful?
Yeah, I think that's like such an important question. I think that so much of what's happened in the last year plus is that districts were just scrambling to figure out a remote option or take account of all the kids. That there really hasn't been, at least in big districts, probably better work in smaller districts where there's fewer fires to put out. But I don't think there's been really good work done, at least in New York City or in other big districts that I've kept like half an eye on, to attend to those kids' needs. I mean, the answer in New York from the mayor has really been like, we have to get the kids back in the building. And then, obviously, as you ask that question, it's worth raising the point that in New York and all over the country, we are seeing consistently that non-white parents and Black parents in particular are many of them, certainly not all, many are really, really skeptical about coming back to school. And I think I mean, that is my primary focus over the next year. Because I'm talking to parents every day who are totally not sure that they're going to come back in the fall and don't know when or if they will come back. I mean, I think we can't underestimate how much the school system is going to change if parents don't think that there is don't feel comfortable coming back for all kinds of, because they don't trust the school system that has been the systemically oppressing kids of color for forever. But I think what's really hard is that a lot of districts' answers are like, get the kids back and we'll figure it out. And a lot of parents are saying, you don't get it, we're not coming back. So that's a mismatch that I think is gonna really be problematic for districts starting very soon.
I totally agree with that. It's, so there's inequity, absolutely. The coronavirus has, really, really widened the gap in terms of life, right? We're in places where there are inequities. If you report on schools and you talk to just friends that live in different areas and neighborhoods across the country, you realize that everyone is not receiving the same services, right? Just thinking about just in my neighborhood, what my kids get, and then reading some of the stories from Chalkbeat, New York, some of Eliza's stories, and just thinking about what the kids in Manhattan are going through just to be educated. It really is a crucial point, and it's something that media, not just specifically education journalists, but in general, media needs to pay more attention to. This is going to impact the future of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the impacts of COVID on education are so layered, right? So Black and Latino people have been way more impacted, just like you're saying, in terms of death rates, and that impacts their kids and their grandkids and their siblings, and it impacts people who lose their caretakers or live in homes with multiple people, or share a room with multiple people, and that affects their schooling or their ability to come to school, whether they have to watch their siblings to come to school. So when writing about equity issues, I think it's important to really consider, this is what we were all talking about, right? Like how what's happening in the world impacts kids' lives and vice versa. Like it's important to consider all of that,
Right.
which I think both Chalkbeat and the Times have been doing a great job with. And then I think there's also been a big concern. There was a big concern at the beginning of the pandemic that the people who are mandated reporters at schools, who are who notice whether kids if something's wrong, who report abuse, they're not having that access anymore. Kids who go to a counselor, they can't have a confidential conversation anymore. And there's plenty of questions about whether the state-run welfare system is a good way to fix those problems, but schools were one major place where those things were found, and there was a lot of worry at the beginning that there was going to be more abuse and more hurt children. And so I'm wondering, and more children who might be lost because to the system because they're homeless or their families are. So I'm wondering what your reporting has shown about that and what it's going to look like moving forward. Nicole, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. So our reporting has totally, borne that out. These folks who are in school, a lot of times school is the first, responder. School raises the flag, and not having that connectedness every day has been an issue. I mean, the enrollment numbers are not looking too great. There's kids that are totally missing, and that were previously enrolled. But if you look at the stories right around the end of the year 2020, just reading through some of Chalkbeat's content as I was doing before I made the transition out of mainstream media, it was surprising to me what children were actually experiencing in terms of, babysitting. being the caregivers at home for younger siblings, having to work because mom or dad was out of a job. But that sort of ground level reporting, eye level with children and young folks is so essential right now, because how else would you know? These are the things that teachers are also seeing. Going, some of them, counselors, teachers, going house to house, looking for children that they have been connected with that go missing or that are not turning their cameras on. These are the types of things that we're seeing in the pandemic environment. So absolutely, to answer your question, that's what our reporting is bearing out all across the network.
Yeah, I mean, same for me on the New York City scale, I would say. I'm following a few kids now who have just been in really, really challenging situations over the last year and who are super not out of the woods. I don't think that we have good data yet. I was one of the people who was really, really concerned about the lack of, basically checks on kids' mental health and even, domestic abuse situations. And I think that's one of those scary things that we actually we don't fully know the scope. We know it's happening. We don't fully know the scope. And I think as more and more kids get back into school buildings, we will learn a lot more that is probably very, is going to need immediate attention.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many questions that I think we just don't have answers to, even in terms of how to report them. Like there's just, there isn't precedent really for how to report this at this scale. And I think part of that is the fault of a lot of journalism not focusing enough on these issues before the pandemic. And some people have been doing amazing work forever, but it's not as institutionalized as it would be. I would like it to have been. So, okay.
Sonali, I just wanted to add, I just dropped a story from Kaylin Belshaw on our national desk in the chat, just about homeless students and the outreach to them. And, it touches on a couple of things. Some of the things that I thought were interesting in this piece is just the pivot, and the ability to do unconventional things in education now, or the willingness to consider them, to sort of reach out to homeless students or underrepresented populations also. Because, with education, sometimes it's like the rules are the rules, but with the pandemic, I mean, just having educators be freed up to really, think about ways to help communities, to connect with kids is really, really encouraging.
Yeah, that is actually a great lead. Thanks for sharing it. And that's a great lead into my next question, which was going to be, are there any innovations that have come up in this time that are positive, or anything that's going to be positive moving forward? Nicole, do you want to take that one first, since you were kind of talking about it already?
I think that, one of the things is that relaxing, hopefully, and being really hyper aware of need, right? So if if the rule says A and the need is B, can we get C going? That type of thing. I think that's important. But of course, remote learning. I mean, using the computers and technology to enhance education. If there's a way for us to incorporate that more fully with in-person education, I think that would be tremendous. It seems as if this has helped us sort of unlock or begin to unlock that technology piece more broadly, and having more access for more kids.
Yeah, and I think it's worth thinking about, I think there will continue to be smaller but still existent remote options come fall. So it's worth thinking about what kind of kid that would actually benefit and what kind of teachers should be doing that work. So not every teacher is super comfortable on remote, but some love it and some are super organized and just really have have really enjoyed it and made great connections on remote. I think remote learning in some form is going to be with us for a while. So what I'm hoping is that districts with a little more lead time and planning time can actually think about marrying, you know, the type of kid who really benefits from remote or who needs remote for a medical reason or a social emotional reason with teachers who have said, actually, this medium really works for me. Because that's really not everyone, as any teacher would say. So I think that is going to be hopefully a sweet spot that we can find this fall that I imagine will continue in education probably indefinitely in some way.
Yeah, both great points. I would also add that this is kind of a very basic positive, but at least at the beginning, it expanded internet access. A lot of people, like I cover LA, Southern California, a lot of people just didn't have internet access on their phone. For years, I've been reporting on kids, internet access and devices. For years, I've been reporting on kids who like use their phone to write essays. And then the pandemic happened and people were saying like, oh my God, kids are having to use their phones to write essays, like they always have. And so now, and so then schools and counties got funding to give hotspots or to try different innovative ways to get internet out to people who didn't have it or to get devices. And that rollout was pretty inequitable. And I think there's still a lot of issues, but that was something that is a basic need that a lot of people didn't have, that there's more awareness of now and that more people have access to. One question I definitely want to ask is, what is a story that you really wanted to do, Eliza, in the past year and weren't able to? And for Nicole, since you're newer to the beat, that you think is that Chalkbeat hasn't done yet that is super important to do. So Eliza, you want to take that first?
Sure. So I think the challenge for me is that my beat, which used to be a features beat, has really become a breaking news beat over the last 14 months. So I am focused on daily stories and quick turnaround stories, and in a way I never have been before in my career. Like I'm filing more than I ever have, and I am much more focused on just breaking news than I ever have been, which brings limitations because you don't have as much time to do features. So what I'm really trying to do now, what I wish I'd done more of, but I literally didn't have time, and what I hope to do more of in the coming months is really dig down on specific kids and families and just tell stories of what people are going through on the ground, which is always like the best kind of reporting. The problem is when you have these massive system-wide structural issues that are unresolved and constantly changing, there was less time for me to focus on individual kids and families. So that is my regret and my plan for the next few months.
Yes, I get that. It's, you know, running in an environment of accelerated breaking news is hard. And it's hard to get face level with folks and figure out how these concepts and this news is playing out in real life. One of the headlines that I noticed while still working at the Free Press, one of Chalkbeat's stories was just about Michigan and the enrollment figures and how there were thousands of kids that were just missing, right? So that's a story that I'm very interested in still. What does the comeback look like for those kids in public education? Is there an effort to reclaim them? How are educators going about it? Are they in charter schools or private school, or is homeschooling taking off? So those are some of the questions I have at the top of my mind right now. Yeah. Or will these figures correct themselves, come next year and we see more, robust enrollments? It's a question.
Yeah, I worry that as the breaking news of COVID ends, that there won't be the same attention to follow-ups that there really has to be for kids. Given how quickly the world moves and how few resources there are really in journalism to get this work done. So it's great that you're keeping an eye on it. I always think it's important for, and maybe this will be the last question before we go to audience questions. I think it's always really important to talk about our own mental health as journalists. Like, covering kids' trauma is hard. And I would love to know, Eliza, how there was also a period where I feel like you were really doing all of the stories. So I would like to know how you take care of yourself, and Nicole, as a manager, how you encourage, and like what that looks like for you as a manager to like what you tell your employees. So Nicole, do you want to start?
Sure, I can. So there was a period at my previous post where, I was running the team that dealt with the coronavirus, the health team, immigration team, the opioid team, federal courts, corruption, all of these areas that were just touched by the pandemic, in addition to entertainment. So it was a lot of people really churning story after story after story. And one day, right, we got news that we would have furloughs, right? And everyone was like, how are we going to do this? Michigan was under siege, hundreds of people were dying every week, if not every day. And having a staff of 40% of journalists, it just became a requirement and an exercise to pick and choose and make really hard choices, right? So those 6 weeks of furlough, I think, after a career of about 20 years, taught me a vital lesson about management and self-care. Because I really didn't know that I needed that week of silence until I got the first one, to just take a break. I mean, because you churn. So in coming to Chalkbeat, I think now I'm at the position where I can really be a champion for taking breaks, building, allowing yourself to understand that as a journalist, you're covering something that nobody else has been down this historic road before. We've had so much over the last 2 years. So allow yourself to sort of sit in that space, build a wall around yourself, take your vacation time, right? So that you can tell these stories of this historic time. It's really important. Self-care is so important.
Yeah, I so appreciate the question. And I mean, just listening to you, I already feel better, Nicole. No, I mean, I definitely had a point last summer when New York was really the education story in some ways, because we're the biggest district in the country, and we were kind of going first on reopening, which was a crazy coincidence, or not coincidence, but it was a crazy situation that New York was really the place that's going to try this first. So yeah, I mean, I would just say, like, I probably wrote a story every 3 days last July and August, and I'm hoping to not have a single byline this July. I'm going to try to take off like as much time as I possibly can, because like, I can't really do it anymore. If I'm being really honest, like I just burned out in a way that is like, I didn't even know it was possible. So yeah, I mean, it's like, that's the thing. You like report like hell. You have crazy adrenaline. I canceled all my vacations last summer. I just like went. I worked literally 24/7 for like 3 months. And now I'm like, okay, if I do that again this summer, I don't want to be a journalist anymore. So yeah, the only thing you can do is like really stop. You go when you have to go, but you also really have to stop.
Yeah, second everything that both of you said. I agree. Nicole, I felt better just hearing you talk. Thank you. I agree with that. I highly recommend therapy for everyone. Like, if anyone in this whole chat wants any help finding a therapist or talking about how to go about that, like, let me know. I've done it for lots of people. I will help you. I think breaks are important. For me, I went on a fellowship leave. I'm doing a fellowship at Columbia University where I'm taking classes for 9 months and working on a book. And it's so weird to be out of the newsroom at a time when all of these huge important things are happening, but I put my trust in the other reporters in my newsroom, and hope that everyone takes rest when they need to. So I will end my moderation there and turn it over to Karen for questions. And thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Those were great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. We do have a lot of questions. We'll try to get through all of them. We have a question, Eliza, for you on the point you'd made about parents who just, they really don't want to send their kids back to school, and there may be people not sending their kids back in the fall. And this relates, I think, also to the point that Nicole made about the children who've been lost to the system. What'll happen? What'll happen to these kids? Where will they go? Will they go to private school? Will they go to charter schools? Will they leave the city schools? Will they, as Nicole mentioned, maybe homeschool? What do you think will happen?
So I think I think it's less private charter and more homeschooling, or more like we're riding out remote for as long as we can. Charters aren't doing something different enough, I think, in a lot of places. I mean, a lot of charters didn't even have any in-person this year in New York. So I don't think charters are doing something different enough to make a huge number of parents say, oh, I don't like the district, but I'll do charter because of remote learning. I think it's more that people are like, I don't want to be back in these buildings indefinitely. So either I'm doing remote for as long as they give me remote, which I think will be some months, if not some years, or I'm gonna homeschool them. Mm-hmm. So that's like, they're like, these kids don't go to school buildings, period, for a long time. It's not that they're just going to a different school building.
Okay. And it sort of on the question of remote, a couple of questions related to that. One person asks whether there's been any silver lining to remote learning. I think you mentioned, Eliza, that it can be helpful for some students, and if there are teachers who can do it well. But is there, can you elaborate on that? And also, what is the fall going to look like when, there's some students doing all remote, some doing in person? What can we expect really in the fall?
So in New York, the goal is 5 days a week for everyone who wants it. So the goal is to get as many parents back as possible to avoid the crunch between in-person and remote. They're going to need people to teach remote, and some teachers will get medical accommodations, although a much, much, much smaller number than have them now, which is some 27% of the teachers we have in New York City are out. Yeah, we think, the mayor is trying to get to 5 days. There's a lot of logistical issues that have to be sorted. We know New York City schools have really been relatively safe places this year. And so we know the health and safety stuff that works. It's only going to get easier as more adults and more kids, 16 and up and soon 12 and up, are vaccinated. So I think the biggest obstacle is actually getting parents Back.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, I just want to jump in with the silver lining piece, just sprinkled throughout some of our coverage. I've seen mention of some connection with parents and teacher, a little bit more interaction in some cases, and also for students who are introverts or shy or have certain types of disabilities. Some of them have been served well by remote learning.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I just dropped a story in the chat that Andrew Kampa from the LA Times wrote last year that was about the students who were at the time thriving with distance learning, keeping in mind that it is hugely hard and terrible for lots and lots of people, but that there are situations like in LAUSD, kids have been protesting school police when they're working from home. They're not on a campus with school police. That doesn't mean that the learning is better, but that is a thing that is different.
Yeah. We have a question here related to mental health. Do you think that the parents should get some special training to help their kids in dealing with some of the mental health issues and stresses. Nicole, any thoughts on that?
Sure, I can just speak personally. Absolutely. I have twins. They are 13 years old, in the 7th grade, those, that sort of tween phase. And thinking about them integrating back into school next year, I have felt like I might need some skills to get them coached up. Sonali mentioned therapy. I'm thinking therapy for myself, therapy for the twins, just to sort of shake off some of that anxiety. They haven't been in the school building for a year and a half or so. I had to pick up something at my child's school, the return of the band money, this great band trip that was planned for 2020 that we could not do. I had to pick it up last week and drove in to the school parking lot and found myself in tears. So, just recognizing that this has been extraordinary and getting prepped to coach kids into another phase of this. Absolutely. That's just my personal opinion. And it's something, as a journalist, now that you've sparked an idea, I'm thinking, is that some type of story? Is someone specializing in that space for parents?
Yeah. Eliza?
Yeah,
What do you
no,
think?
I mean, I would totally agree. I think the biggest mistakes that you could make as a journalist is to underestimate the trauma that families are feeling right now. That trauma is going to affect every aspect of schooling for a very, very long time.
Yeah. One of our viewers is joining us from North Carolina, actually, and she notes that the state is creating some new learning programs for the summer, but she also says that these kids are going to have to face this sort of additional pressure of learning, and when they may need some rest and some, just the kind of thing you all were talking about earlier, some understanding, and maybe what they need is for the gym or those sports programs to pick up. So is it fair, to the extent that there are going to be learning programs in the summer, is there a certain way in which they should be designed? What's going on in that arena right now in terms of summer activities that you're watching?
Yeah, I don't have any specific intel on North Carolina and that program. I think and those summer school programs. I do think, just hearing that and reading it here in the chat, I do think that all school systems are going to be different, and it's not for us as journalists to determine sort of what's fair and what's not fair, but sort of looking at, is it fitting a need? Is it fitting the need of the population in that area? I think that's what we need to hold to account.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to make a determination of sort of fairness, like, is it effective? Is it helping? There was a podcast I listened to on education about 2 weeks ago, and one of the education experts warned against sort of wanting to correct the ship like right away, and address learning loss and get everyone up to speed. And he said, maybe we just need to be back at school, right? And just do that and count that as a victory. So, interesting thought.
There's a follow-up to the earlier question, and maybe I had misstated what was being asked, but in looking at both the remote and the in-person teaching, which leads to the hybrid schedules being necessary, there's a teacher shortage, in a sense, for everybody who is available to do those kinds of things. Certainly in some districts there are teacher shortages. So how is that being addressed, do you think, and how can it be addressed effectively?
I would say first that we actually are lucky in that there's a lot of warnings about teacher shortages, but we're really not seeing it in a lot of districts. Teacher retirements and teacher turnover in New York is much lower right now than it's ever been. So the way that you sort of logistically avoid that is that you have a very, very modest remote option. So some districts may make kids essentially qualify or even like apply for a remote option or look at their family's medical situation or understand what the situation is at home. And then you pick teachers to do remote either who have medical accommodations. Again, I think it's gonna be a really, really much smaller number of teachers or who really wanna do remote. And that way, basically, you know, in New York, you probably have to get, you know, 80% of the kids in person. And so you just assume that the vast majority of teachers and kids are gonna be in the building in order to avoid that split. Also remember, districts have tons of money. So like, if they need to like pad out their which they already did this year in New York when they had no money, pad out the staffing a little bit to avoid hybrid, which the mayor has already promised there will be no hybrid because hybrid doesn't work. I think that's what you'll see.
Okay.
So one of the things that I've been warned about from Sarah Darville, who is the managing editor of our national team, is the wanting clean numbers on the teacher shortage at this point. The same thing with the other numbers we were talking about. It's not there yet. I'm told in our, you know, from our reporting. However, I think it's something that we should definitely keep an eye on. The Detroit Bureau just dropped a story, Kobe Levin wrote it, about the teacher turnover rate in Michigan. It was very surprising, and it sort of walked through what teacher turnover means to students and that how that can be impactful in a negative way. So it's certainly something that we'll just sort of keep monitoring.
Okay. Eliza, you talked about the kind of stories, the sorts of stories you'd like to do, and really going deeper with students and parents. I wondered for all of you, you know, for everybody, reporting really has changed over the last year and the way we do reporting. But reporting with kids has always been different, right? I mean, you need special access, you need parental permission, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how things have changed in terms of talking with kids and getting stories at this time. Eliza, maybe you could start.
I mean, so not that much in some ways. I mean, you don't get to see them in a lot of cases at school, which sucks because that's like where you want to be. But sometimes you do. And I'm talking to a lot of kids right now because the school is still the nexus of where you find these kids. So I just write to principals and teachers who I know and say, like, I really want to start talking to kids. Give me some kids who I can like start connecting with. So like my basic reporting stuff there has actually not changed. It's just that you can't see them in school, or like, you know, sometimes you sit in on a remote class that's like.
And have parents been more or less receptive, or is it about the same?
Well, I think it's just the safety thing. Like I haven't been able to physically meet some of these kids, and I don't know when I will. And some of them are not planning to be vaccinated, or their parents are not planning to be vaccinated. So that's a challenge. But you know, I'm going to meet a bunch of kids outside this summer in masks, and we'll just do it.
Okay.
So at Chalkbeat, I've just been really impressed. I'm sorry, my internet is acting unstable. Just really impressed with the outreach to kids and school communities in terms of, you know, questionnaires online, lots of emails back and forth, really cultivating relationships not only with children, but with their families. It takes longer. It's more intentional, but I just really learned a lot from watching the staff work on those connections. And if, you know, some of our coverage of the verdict in Minneapolis recently sort of showed how connected the journalists at Chalkbeat are to youth communities. You know, lots of kids responding in email, calling us back, that type of thing. And those things are hard to do in media because, you know, adolescents are They're young. So just having a relationship and being trustworthy, you know, and being seen as a forum for young voices is really important.
Right, right. Well, we're going to have to close at this time, but I want to thank Sonali, Nicole, and Eliza. This has been a really great conversation, and thank you so much all for participating.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you for having us. Thank you.
And there will be a recording available. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.